All right, the damning report into the death of toddler Mason Jet Lee has revealed Queensland's Department of Child Safety failed him in nearly every possible way. And Townsville battles a youth crime epidemic. I spoke to LNP Shadow Minister for Police Dan Purdie just a short time ago.
I think, like all Queenslanders and all Australians, what we've heard over the last couple of days about the findings are absolutely horrific. But unfortunately, in Queensland over the last few weeks, it's just one of a number of horrific cases where the Minister for Child Safety and is overseeing a broken department which is letting down vulnerable kids in our communities.
What would the LNP do to fix child safety? Because obviously throwing money at it doesn't work. I actually think we should have a Royal Commission.
Well, Gleeso, you're not the first person that's mentioned that to me over the last few weeks. But, when we were in government, bearing in mind I was a police officer at the time, back in 2012 to 15, I was on the front line in the Child Protection Investigation Unit as a detective here on the coast. But it was the LNP that commissioned the Carmody inquiry. And then they did have a roadmap to try and fix the system. But more recently, with the change of government, so obviously hasn't been a priority for this current government. We continually see just young junior staff get thrown under a bus. I was in the CPIU here on the coast back in 4 years ago when the Mason Jet Lee incident happened. And I remember at the time the Child Safety Minister at that time came out pretty quickly and just threw a handful of junior staff members under a bus. And there's no doubt now that we've seen the report, serious mistakes were made by staff, a number of staff, 21 staff members at docks. But what I'm saying to you, Gleeso, is if 21 people in a department are making mistakes, I don't know if it's human error. I think it's a system failure. Leadership starts at the top, so does culture. And as we continually see with the Labor Palaszczuk government, no one ever takes responsibility. So I think the minister at a minimum needs to step down, and there needs to be a wholesale change to the way the system operates, because the system is broken, and week after week we're hearing heartbreaking stories across Queensland of these young kids that are dying tragic deaths, and something needs to change.
Well said, Dan, and of course it really does come back to culture. I mean, the culture is clearly toxic, and we're getting that anecdotally every day here in Queensland, that the culture in that particular department is not what it should be. Let's switch gears and talk a little bit about border closures. The Premier has dug right in. She's using the medical advice of Dr Jeanette Young to keep the borders closed. There's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of lack of clarity for small businesses and tourism operators, and they're howling at the moment. Despite the fact that the Deputy Chief Medical Officer in Canberra, Professor Paul Kelly, says it's okay to open the borders. There is no medical evidence to suggest that the borders should be closed. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, Gleeso, in my electorate here on the Sunshine Coast, I'm talking to you from Coolum at the moment, the businesses, the tourism industry is bleeding. And what they want is a clear roadmap, some certainty as to when we can get out of this. They're concerned, my tourism operators and accommodation providers on the coast are seriously concerned that people from Coolum and from Queensland on the school holidays coming up can go to Kingscliff, can go to Byron, can go to Yamba, and then come back in after a couple of weeks' holidays as a resident without any issue. But people from Queensland, but people from New South Wales can't do the same here. We can't attract New South Wales tourists. So look, and the problem with this has been that there's been no clear roadmap. The Premier will say one thing, the roadmap says another, then she announces a potential September opening. And we just need leadership on this issue. We need a clear roadmap, and the businesses in my electorate and across Queensland just want some certainty as to when they can get back to businesses, because it's costing businesses, it's costing jobs, and it's costing livelihoods.
Isn't it extraordinary that if you lived in Tweed Heads, you could drive to Melbourne for a holiday, but you couldn't drive a kilometre over the border and have a break in Coolangatta? I just find the whole thing extraordinary. Before we go, Dan, now, as a former police officer, you've seen some of the issues in relation to youth crime, not just in North Queensland, but around the state. But we're talking specifically about places like Townsville and Cairns now. And as the opposition's police spokesman, you'd be across the fact that the escalation in youth crime in those particular areas is causing widespread angst. What would the LNP do to fix that?
Once again, Gleeso, I was on the front line in the CPIU back in 2015 when this government took over and consistently watered down the Youth Justices Act. Police at the time on the front line warned the government that was leading towards a crime epidemic, a youth crime epidemic. And that's what we have now. And it's not just me saying that, Glee. So I'm not just dog whistling about that. The president of the police union last year called the youth crime crisis an epidemic. And we've now got police now just powerless to stop the epidemic, because the current government has watered down the bail laws, watered down the Youth Justice Act, and police are powerless to hold these kids in custody. There's no deterrent, there's no repercussions. These young offenders are back out on the street committing further offences before the police have even finished the paperwork. So something needs to give. We need to arm our police with better laws and better legislation and policy and resources to keep people in Townsville safe. And I understand, I speak to my old colleagues up in Townsville, and they are concerned. Night after night, they're getting rammed by these young grubs in stolen cars. They've got no regard for the law, no regard for police, because there's no consequences. And we need tougher laws, tougher policy, and more resources for our police on the front line to keep our communities safe. And places like Townsville, unfortunately, are feeling the brunt of this crime epidemic night after night.